Presumed guilty under scrutiny. The GRAP Files. Welcome back to Presumed Guilty, Episode 2, the GRAP File Unsealed, the anatomy of a billion-dollar betrayal. I'm your host, Roger Warstone. Last week, you got a glimpse into the man they will later try to label a criminal, a man who built his life on service and integrity. I shared my hard-won journey from the streets of Cali, Colombia, to becoming one of the most successful Army National Guard recruiters in the state. I found purpose, security, and immense pride in my service. But as my professional life reached this peak, I watched that foundation of trust and service crumble. Washed away by a billion-dollar tidal wave of greed, sheer incompetence, and legally questionable chaos. Today, we open the file on the machine that enabled that betrayal, the Guard Recruiting and Assistance Program, or GRAP. I want to start with a necessary truth, a truth that defines the gravity of this betrayal. The U.S. Army has a system that is better than anything, any corporation you have seen or heard in the entire world. It is a complex machine of ethics, efficiency, and selfless sacrifice, built to withstand external pressure. I truly love the core way the system was made. The fundamental problem isn't the system itself, it's the people who learn the system, find holes around it, and with enough audacity and self-interest, push the boundaries of a protocol without any fear, causing others who are trying to do the right thing to feel scared. That, my friends, is precisely how you break the most robust machine. This exploitation, this illegal way of confusing the soldiers' ethics is where the system breaks down. And the leadership structure, which is supposed to be the moral anchor, often fails. When a senior leader decides not to fight something that appears fundamentally wrong, they lose the very essence of leadership, the core of who we are supposed to be. In the Army, I learned the sacrificial part of my country and my comrades. I'll be the guy who will wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning for a physical training test for a friend who was struggling running alongside him to help him make the 2 miles. That motivation, that bond, that commitment to never leaving a comrade behind, that's the actual reality that makes you a soldier. Where did that part of many of these leaders die? They played the role of good actors, excellent actors, whom at the end of the day were only looking out for themselves and their career progressions. They didn't want the disturbance. They didn't want to become a distraction to the unit, the battalion, the brigade, or the army itself. They chose self-preservation over ethical engagement, leaving the mess for the soldiers on the ground to clean up, or in my case, to be blamed for it. Let's begin by contrasting the core of my service with the rot that was creeping into the system. In the middle of the Iraq War, our brave Pennsylvania units were deploying and suffering serious casualties. The call of duty was deafening. I felt a profound obligation, a duty greater than my recruiting quotas. Despite having a large family, I volunteered for deployment, signed up to go with an MP unit. I wanted to be on the battle, serving my country at its point of need. That was my core motivation, service and sacrifice. My command found out and immediately blocked me. They used my technicality of my state status versus a federal Title X deployment to keep me tethered to the recruiting office. The rationale was brutally honest. You are too valuable as a recruiter to lose, they warned me. I will sacrifice my career promotions and incentives if I resign. I put service first, but my command put numbers first. The sheer irony, the utter pain of that moment only deepened when I later saw one of my own soldiers successfully do exactly what I wanted, deploy, and easily return to his recruiting post because the job had become so undesirable. I was denied the right to fight for the sake of a quota, while the system of unchecked chaos was ushered into the chase cash. And those quotas were already driving an incredible high-stake, stressful environment. We, the full-time recruiters, were not just soldiers. We were essentially highly trained sales professionals. We endured a rigorous 54-day specialized recruiting school. We'd receive necessary special pay and travel incentives, which, like any corporate sales job, were essential to constantly fighting to meet quotas. Our focus had to be outside the box, better than any civilian sales job, because our product was commitment of a human life to military service. In this pressurized ethical environment, the introduction of the Guard Recruiting and Assistance Program, or GRAP, wasn't just another incentive. It was the moment the high level incompetence of the military industrial complex delivered a catastrophe betrayal to the average soldier. This program took an ethical, high pressure job and turned it into a financial free for all with an illegal private contractor, DocuPack, at the very center. Today, we expose the staggering legal and financial chaos at the heart of the billion-dollar failure. This wasn't minor corruption, this was massive, systematic waste that set the stage to unjustly blame the lowest ranking participants, the very soldiers who risked everything. The story of GRAP is the anatomy of a betrayal executed by reckless, self serving, high level policy. This segment is the legalized chaos and the structure of greed. The Army's approach to solving the post 9/11 recruiting crisis was shockingly simple. They chose to operate outside of the confines of their own excellent system and throw money at the problem from every direction, using three primary budgets simultaneously, all without clear administrative control. Layer 1, the full-time recruiter, the professional, and the audited. We were trained professionals. We spent 54 days in school establishing a solid foundation of military ethics, regulations, and recruiting best practices. We received a salary, special duty pay, and money for recruiting expenses, a justifiable audited cost to specialized crucial function. Layer 2, the internal help, the ADSW money pit. ADSW stands for Active Duty Special Board. These were short-term orders given to active duty soldiers to assist us recruiters. The use of these orders often became a desperate exercise in budgetary mismanagement and waste. Commanders terrified of losing next year's budget would issue these orders frantically near the fiscal year end in late September just to burn the budget. This resulted in short, high-cost tours for soldiers who were often unprepared for underutilized, creating a pool of massive internal financial waste. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of lighting cash on fire to meet an arbitrary deadline. Layer 3, the GRAP escalation, the external cash incentive. Then came the GRAP incentive itself. Starting at $1,000 per recruiter in 2005, the financial urgency was so acute that by 2006, the incentive doubled to a total of $2,000 per recruit. This sudden aggressive jump in pay signaled pure desperation and indifference to accountability. But this final layer was administered through a truly shocking and legally questionable structure, the outsourcing of a core government functional to a private contractor. So, if that $1,000 didn't work only for a few months, why didn't they just tested it out for at least 2 years or 3 years instead of pumping it up all the way to $2,000? Someone wanted to make money. The shadow employer and program manager. The entire GRAP program was outsourced to a private contractor called DocuPack, formerly Document and Packaging Brokers, Inc., now known as DocuPack. DocuPack didn't just administer the program. They became the shadow employer for the thousands of military personnel operating under a contract that would later be deemed illegal. We also note that the owner of DocuPack at the time was acquainted with a director of the National Guard and Association that certainly adds significant layer of scrutiny to this massive no-bid deal. The legal quagmire, independent contractor status. The most critical detail here is the employment status. DocuPact hire National Guard soldiers and airmen who participated in GRAP as subcontractors or independent contractors, RAs. This meant that in their role as recruiting assistants, they were legally working for DocuPact, not the National Guard. The contract they signed was an independent contractor agreement. This seemingly minor legal distinction had massive, devastating implications for the soldiers. First, the tax burden, the ticking financial time bomb. RAs were not standard military employees for this pay. They were responsible for their own taxes. We're talking about 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and the other ones, of course, a little older, but you're thinking for kids. This meant they were required to pay an estimated 33% of their earnings to the government later on. This was a critical failure of communication and management, adding a layer of financial instability and complexity, creating a ticking tax bomb for those RAs, recruiting assistants, who didn't properly save their earnings. The Army handed out the cash with no ethical warning, and DocuPact created a tax liability. The other one is the unfair contrast, devaluing professionalism. While full-time recruiters endure 54 days in specialized recruiting school, RAs were often selected and trained in 1 day using a simple computer-based course provided by DocuPact. Yet, these RAs, recruiting assistants, who were essentially part-time civilian contractors, received the full $2,000 payment. It was an organizational setup that visibly, admittedly, and unjustly devalued the training of professionalism and commitment of the actual recruiting force. The contractual fraud triggers. DocuPact's contract with the recruiting assistants was a simple find someone, get them to join, and we'll pay you a bonus agreement. But the rules intended to prevent conflict of interest were so rigid and confusing that they became the primary triggers for later fraud prosecutions. First contact rule. The recruiting assistant had to be the first person to successfully identify and recruit an individual who was not already working with a full-time National Guard recruiter. This rule was almost impossible to enforce or prove unequivocally in the real world, turning every successful recruitment into a potential violation. Exclusion of full-time recruiters. Full-time recruiters were strictly ineligible to participate and could not claim referral bonus. Even though, as recruiters, every time we recruited somebody, no matter even if the RAs recruited them, we still got a bonus for a certain amount of recruiters we got during that time period. No payment splitting kickbacks. Recruiting assistants were explicitly prohibited from splitting the payment of providing kickbacks to full-time recruiters or other ineligible personnel. That's usually the active duty component. These rigid rules, overseen by a private contractor, created a system where thousands of recruiting assistants and the recruiters they work with could be easily targeted for violations in a high-pressure, numbers-driven environment. This segment is the crushing weight of the unethical climate. The warnings for me were not in a memo. They were immediate and personal, rooted in the chaos this flawed system created. This was the moment the ethical foundation of my job began to crack, and the failure of leadership was laid bare. The failure of leadership. This is the central point of the betrayal. The pressure from above became relentless. Commandos prioritizing their careers and worry about justifying the massive amounts of money flowing through DocuPact demanded results. They actively chose to ignore the illegal way of confusing the soldiers' ethics that was destroying the system. They were the good actors looking out for themselves. When a leader decides to not fight something that appears fundamentally wrong, they lose the very essence of leadership. They chose to allow the ethical corruption to fester because Fighting it would make them a distraction, not the chain of command. The pressure cooker and the hustle culture. The recruiting stations became a feeding ground for opportunities who had the balls to push the protocol. I started seeing recruiting assistants I didn't know. Civilians hired by DocuPack after a single day of online training, coming into my office with a long list of names, focused only on getting that initial $1,000 payout. This wasn't professional recruiting. It was a pure cash for name hustle. We had recruiting assistants who were essentially operating as predatory lead generators. With no real connection to the service, they were ostensibly promoting the creation of a monster. The chaos created by GRAP fostered intense resentment and unethical atmosphere that created a monster among people who were not in the program and could not get in the program. Those who were excluded from recruiting assistant money or who were following the rules ethically watched their less ethical colleagues get a little more money. This led to crippling internal hostility, jealousy, and the very types of questionable practices that the program was supposed to prevent. Soldiers started looking for shortcuts and lines between legitimate recruiting and contractual fraud blurred beyond all recognition, thanks to the sheer volume of money and the lack of oversight. My own compromise. I was caught in the middle of this moral collapse. I had my own successful ethical system, but I was forced to integrate the GRAP system to keep up the demands and the quotas. The detective in me was already activated, watching the perfect storm of greed and chaos brewing. I knew I couldn't trust the system, so I worked with extreme caution, putting my own personal layer of scrutiny on every single referral that came across my desk. I knew that one mistake, one compromised referral could be catastrophic, and the failure of my leadership would be a failure to protect my soldiers. The first bite this program took was in a formal investigation. It was a profound ethical one. It forced me, a soldier who would rather be fighting in Iraq and uphold the highest standards of service, to compromise my principles for a system that was financially and legally reckless from the top down. This here is the conclusion, the unintended target. The final financial toll for GRAP was astronomical, exceeding $1 billion. I'm not just talking about just the DocuPack. I'm talking about the soldiers, the services, and the CID agents that did all this work. All together had to be more than $1 billion. And when the political scrutiny finally arrived, when Congress and government demanded answers for the missing money, the generals and the high-ranking officials knew they couldn't admit to two major failures. They failed to oversee their own budget and staff ADSW recruiter incentives. They failed to oversee an illegal $1 million contract run by a private vendor, DocuPack, who made out with $9 million and they never took a cent from them. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a narrative. They needed to show the American people that the money wasn't a waste by bad policy and managerial incompetence. It was stolen by greedy, low-ranking soldiers. They sacrificed the integrity of the lowest ranks to protect the reputation of the highest. They created the machine. They paid the contractor to run it. And then they used that very machine with its flawed contracts and unenforceable rules to destroy the people who operated it. The initial reporting of fraud didn't come from military auditors. It came from the private company DocuPack, who had the most to lose. Next week in episode 3, we pull back to the curtains on the initial investigation. DocuPack reported the fraud. But who did the Army CID decide to target? And how did I, the recruiter who prioritized service over cash and ethics over career, become an instant person of interest in their own hunt for a thief? Subscribe now and join us as we continue to expose the truth and presume guilty under scrutiny. They found the guilty party, but they never found the truth. And my mission is just beginning. Hi, thank you for listening to the end of the show. This is Roger Warstone. This here is an ad from Warstone Detective Agency. I'm a private detective with extensive experience in uncovering the truth behind complex cases. Whether suspicious changes in behavior, unexplained expenses, or physical signs that you just can't add up, our team is equipped to investigate discreetly and professionally. At Warstone, we specialize in criminal investigations spanning multiple areas of law, family cases, including custody cases, locating missing person, and infidelity investigations. We also do fraud detection and security service to safeguard your peace of mind and assets. If you're noticing those physical red flags that the military did to me, don't face the uncertainty alone. Having a skilled investigator working quietly in the background can be the difference between doubt and clarity. Remember, you're not just looking for an answer, you're reclaiming your life and your peace. Keep Warstone Detective Agency in mind as your trusted partner whenever you need an expert, support, or professional investigations, Philadelphia. Thank you for listening and stay safe until the next episode.